UFC was founded in 1993 under Semaphore Entertainment Group, or known as SAG, by 6 men. And these 6 men were Dorian Gracie, Art Davey, Bob Merowitz, Campbell McLaren, David Isaacs, and John Mills. There are no clear documents that shows the exact ownership of each founder. So the safest assumption in this case is to assume all 6 founders had equal portions of the UFC. And UFC was unlike nothing people have ever seen before. Just 2 guys going at each other. Little to no rules, pure heart and guts. And people loved it. Even though people loved it, certain people did not. Especially a certain politician, United States Senator John McCain. He hated the UFC and he called the concept human cockfighting. Now, I am a UFC fan. I am going to assume that majority of you all probably UFC fans too. But the UFC we know today is not what it used to be. There was not even a referee. There were no weight classes. Technically speaking, back in the day, UFC current heavyweight champion John Jones could fight the UFC flyweight champion Alexander Pantoja, and there was nothing wrong about it because there were no weight classes. Backyard fighting, but inside an arena. So the statement made by the Senator John McCain was kind of partially true. Unlike an average citizen disliking UFC, John McCain was different because John had power. So he basically led a campaign to get the UFC banned in the United States and globally. UFC is now in a tough place. They can't promote their events in any publications, they can't broadcast their events in any broadcast networks, and they were even having trouble trying to find a place to put their events. With all this pressure towards UFC, 5 of the 6 founders left the UFC, leaving Bob Merowitz the whole ownership of the UFC. Now it's 22nd of September 2000. It was UFC 27. 2 men attended this event. One of these men were Lorenzo Fertitta and the other man was called Dana White. They both came to watch the event and something was pretty apparent, that the company was dying. There was little to no crowd, no merch, no way to purchase the event to watch from home, nothing. And Lorenzo spoke to Dan about how amazing and huge UFC could be if right things were done right. And now before we continue with the story, I think it's important for us to understand the relationship between Lorenzo Fertitta and Dan White, and also what these 2 men were doing at this time. Lorenzo Fertitta was one of the Fertitta brothers. The other man was Frank Fertitta, and they were crazy rich. They were business moguls and they owned a station casino, at that time the 3rd largest casino in the US. And Lorenzo and Dana were high school friends. They knew each other since around the age of 14 and they went to school together. Over time, they grew apart, but after Dana moved back to Vegas, they got back together. The good old friendship is back again. At this time, Dana was actually in the fighting business. He managed 2 fighters, one of these fighters being Tito Ortiz and the other being Chuck Liddell. Now, let's get back on with the story. Both of these fighters Dana White managed actually fought in the UFC, and one of these fighters, Chuck Liddell, had a problem with how much he was getting paid from the UFC. So he called his manager, Dana White, and asked him to, speak with the UFC and get him a higher paycheck. Dana White agreed, and then he spoke to the UFC. Dana White called Bob Merowitz, the current owner of the UFC, and basically said, "Hey, Chuck Liddell is one of the biggest names in the sport right now. I think he deserves to get paid more." Bob rejected. Dana White called again. Bob Merowitz rejected again. Dana White called for the 3rd time, to which Bob Merowitz lost his Bob basically screamed at Dana White saying that UFC do not have any money and how much trouble UFC was in financially and how close they are to going bankrupt. And Bob cut the phone, but Dan had a plan. Dana immediately called Lorenzo Fertitta. Dana said, "I think UFC is going to go bankrupt. I think you should buy it." Lorenzo immediately called Bob and said, "I want to buy the company." Bob said, "Well, I'll give you 50% for $1 million. To which Lorenzo said, "I'll give you $2 million, just give me the whole company." So, after about a month of negotiations, Bob Merowitz sold 100% of the UFC to Fertitta Brothers. And Fertitta Brothers created the parent company called Zuffa. By the way, the Zuffa in Italian means to fight. That's pretty cool. And they made Dana White the president of the UFC and gave him 10% of the company. So the UFC ownership now looks something like this. Fertitta brothers own 90% of the company and Dana White owns 10%. I think it's important for us to understand the UFC Fertitta brothers board and Dana White operated back in the day was nowhere near the UFC we know today. It was a failing business that was losing money left, right and center, and also was the target of a political campaign run by a US senator. So they had to do the right things first. They regulated the sport with the help of the Nevada Athletic Commission. The process actually went pretty smoothly because of the fact that Lorenzo Fertitta was a part of the Nevada Athletic Commission. And Dana White made a good team of people who had both sports and business experience to make UFC a success. Within a couple of months, UFC has made good progress. They have weight classes, they have rules and regulations, and also now they have referees. The sport was getting standardized and UFC was pioneering the change. But there was a problem. Even though Dana was doing his best, he did not have a lot of moving pieces that he can use to make UFC a success. What I mean by this is, by the time Fertitta brothers bought the UFC, Bob Merovitz have sold a bunch of things that were related to the UFC. Many things such as merchandise rights, DVD rights, video game rights, the library of past fights, and a majority of things that make the UFC brand identity was gone. In reality, Dana White only had the UFC logo, a wooden octagon, and about 12 employees to work with. To show you how much of a dire condition UFC was in when it comes to their brand identity, when the whole internet thing was booming and everybody was trying to get on the internet, UFC could not, because UFC.com was actually already owned by another company called User Friendly Computers. UFC did not even have their own website domain to work with, and after about a year or two, Fertitta brothers had already invested around $40 million into the company, only for nothing to be profitable. And Fertitta brothers realized that they could not put in any more money. It was pointless. Fertitta brothers called Dana White and said, see if you can sell the company. So Dana White looked around, talked to a couple of people and realized that UFC would only be worth somewhere around 5 to 6 million at their current state. So he got back to Fertitta brothers and they immediately realized they will not be selling this company for a profit. Yes, they bought it for 2 million, but they had already invested closer to $40 million into this. Fertitta brothers said to Dana White, F it, let's keep on going. And they kept on going. UFC was still trying to be profitable and trying to put on more successful events. And this was also the same time they wanted to do new things. One of the companies they looked at to get inspiration was actually WWE. And they looked at their almost reality show like style and realized, why can't we replicate some of that? Dana White and the team came up with this idea for something called the Ultimate Fighter. The Ultimate Fighter that we all know today. Two rival teams stuck inside a house and they fight each other, and at the end, the winners fight in a live event. That was the bare bones idea of this show. And Dana White wanted to make this a reality, so he called Lorenzo Fertitta, and Lorenzo spoke with Frank and they agreed to put in $10 million to the production of this reality show. But they said something to Dana White at the same time they made the transaction. This is the last bit of money we are giving to the UFC. If this doesn't succeed, UFC is over. Dana said understood, took the money, worked with the team to put on the reality show, spoke with multiple broadcasting companies, and at the end they settled with Spike TV and they broadcast the show. And what happened? Well, the show was an instant success. It became one of the most popular reality shows at the time. The popularity of the show translated into the live audiences. Now people are actually watching the live events, and UFC was making money. Realizing the success of the reality show and how well it translated into their live audiences, they renewed the show for a new season. The rest was history. Now we are in 2016. UFC ownership now looks something like this. Fertitta brothers owned 80%. Flash Entertainment, the Abu Dhabi government-owned company, owned 10%. Dana White owned the other 10%. And UFC is the most popular it has ever been. Business was good, fights were entertaining, and there was a huge fan base. And at this time, a certain man had his interest on the UFC. And this man went by the name Ariel Emanuel. And who's Ariel Emanuel? He's an entertainment mogul, the owner and the CEO of WME IMG Group, the Hollywood king. and he was really interested in the UFC. Or in other words, he wanted to buy the UFC. Negotiations began. On July 2016, Fertitta Brothers sold a majority stake of the UFC to WME-IMG Group. And how much was it sold for? $4.025 billion. The company that was initially bought by Fertitta Brothers for $2 million was sold on July 2016 for $4 billion. And this is where I want to make this extremely clear. Only 50.1% of the UFC was sold for $4 billion. $4 billion was only for half of the company. So now the UFC looks something like this. The previous owners owned 49.9% and WME-IMG Group owns 50.1%. Now, some of you who may be familiar with the UFC history might be asking, well, who on earth is WME-IMG? I thought Endeavor bought the UFC. October 2016, WME-IMG was renamed to Endeavor. At the point when they bought the UFC, it was not called Endeavor, but moving forward, I'll be calling it Endeavor, not WME-IMG. So now you know Endeavor owns 50.1% of the company, right? But here's the case. In reality, that's true, but technically not really. In order to buy a majority stake in the UFC, Endeavor needed $4 billion. And in order to raise this $4 billion, Endeavor partnered up with multiple private equity firms to raise this money. It's a $4 billion transaction we're talking about. As a result of this, a majority of the $4 billion came from these private equity firms. These equity firms such as MSD Capital, KKR and Silver Lake ended up owning around 40% of the UFC. They did not directly own the UFC, they just owned around 40% of the 50.1% Endeavor owned in the UFC. Also, keep this name Silver Lake in mind. This company is really important for our future story. Now we are in 2021. Endeavor is trying to go public, but they had a problem. One of their biggest assets, being the UFC, was only 50.1% owned by Endeavor, and they wanted to buy the rest of the company and own 100% of the UFC. And a deal was proposed by Endeavor to the remaining shareholders of the UFC, and the deal was agreed upon. The terms of the deal was like this. Some owners were paid by Endeavor stocks in return for their ownership, and the other owners were outright purchased. And if for some reason Endeavor did not go public, the deal would fail. Since the terms of the deal was agreed upon, now it was a waiting game. And we did not have to wait long. April 28, 2021. Within the same month, this deal was revealed to the public. Endeavor went public. Now Endeavor owns 100% of the UFC. And now how much did Endeavor pay to buy this 49.9% of the company? Now we know according to the terms of the deal, part of that ownership was bought with Endeavor stocks. The rest involved money. And exactly how much money was involved? If you look this up, you actually would not get a clear-cut answer. There are certain cases they would say the number is $1.75 billion, but this is nowhere near true. First of all, UFC is a more valued company in 2021 compared to 2016. So it does not make sense at all for Endeavor to pay $4 billion, 50% of the company back in 2016, and only to pay 1.75 for, let's just say, 30 to 40% of the company, since the rest involved Endeavor stocks. And you do not have to even logically think about this number, because I'll tell you where this $1.75 billion number comes from. It's actually from an SEC filing that stated Endeavor is looking to raise $1.75 billion. It is not the actual amount Endeavor spent to secure this transaction. It was actually the amount Endeavor was trying to raise on top of the already existing capital they had. Whatever the number was, it was way more than $1.75 billion. This number is not publicly available unless you know someone who works at Endeavor or in the top level of UFC. I'm sorry to break it to you, but neither me nor do a lot of media members. But we can make some safe assumptions. And the safest assumption that I can make is it probably involved more than $4 billion this time. But I can't be sure, and do not quote me on this. So now the UFC ownership looks something like this. Endeavor owns 100% of the company, and now since Endeavor is a publicly traded company, whoever owns Endeavor owns the UFC. And the ownership was predicted to stay this way, and everybody thought this would be it. But things started to change. In order for us to know exactly what changed, let's move in time to 2023. Now we are in April 2023. Rumors about WWE being sold started flying around, and people did not really have to wait a long time to figure out exactly what was going on. On April 3rd, 2023, it was officially announced WWE will be bought by Endeavor and combined with the UFC to form a new publicly traded company called TKO. And after some negotiations, on September 12, 2023, the merger was finalized. If I were to visualize this managing structure, it would look something like this. UFC and WWE is directly owned by TKO, in which a significant portion was owned by Endeavor and the rest was publicly traded. To figure out who owns the UFC, we have to look at who owns TKO. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. TKO is a publicly traded company, meaning major shareholders are publicly available information. But there's a small problem with this. There are hundreds of sources that you can find on the internet that tells you certain shareholder percentages, but the numbers always seems to be different from each source to source. So I looked through the sources and I settled down with Yahoo Finance, and this is the most accurate information I can find as of March 30th. So here's how the TKO ownership looks. 12.4% of shares are held by insiders of the TKO holdings, meaning people at Endeavor and some folks at WWE. The rest of the shares are mainly held by institutions, with the top 5 being Vanguard Group owning 7.53, BlackRock owning 7.5, Morgan Stanley owning 7.33, Linsell Train Limited owning 6.83, and FMR owning 4.94%. And yes, those companies I mentioned, Vanguard, BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, do own those percentages of TKO. Regardless of what the source you are looking at, the only difference is the exact percentage they use, not the fact that whether they do or do not own those percentages of TKO. But these are the institutions. What about one person, like an individual who owns major stocks in the UFC? There is one, and that man is none other than the big dog himself, Vince McMahon. This man single-handedly owns a huge portion of TKO, sometimes even larger than some institutions. But my boy Vince McMahon is in a really tough situation right now. And if you know anything about Vince, you know where I'm going to go with the story next. With the recent sexual misconduct allegations that have been brought, he already left the WWE, and on January 2024, he resigned from TKO. How much of the TKO did he own? Well, it doesn't really matter how much he owned, because he sold every single one of the shares of TKO he held. On November 14th, 2023, Vince sold 8.4 million shares of TKO for $641 million. On March 7th, 2024, Vince sold additional 5.35 million shares for $412 million. And on 12th of April 2024, Vince has already put his remaining 8.02 million shares for sale for $776 million. And in the corporate world, when you put your shares to sale, usually someone else buys it within a couple of days. Now it's safe to assume Vince has sold every single one of his TKO shares. And dude made over $1 billion just from TKO shares. The UFC ownership now looks something like this. WWE and the UFC is combinedly owned by TKO, which is publicly traded, in which a significant portion is owned by Endeavor, and Endeavor is publicly traded too. Remember when I told you to keep the name Silver Lake in mind? April 2024, this company Silver Lake bought the rest of the Endeavor shares and now owns 100% of Endeavor. The deal is agreed upon and it is set to finish around the Q1 of 2025. It is a slow process, but the deal is finalized. But the interesting part about this deal was that they agreed upon something, and that something was to leave TKO alone, meaning TKO is not a part of this deal, resulting in TKO to be publicly traded just like it is right now. So now let's add Silver Lake to the chart, and it looks something like this. The UFC ownership is kind of complex, but trust me, it is really simple compared to some other popular ownership hierarchies. The simplest way to grasp the UFC ownership debate is to basically understand whoever owns TKO owns the UFC. Now, is the ownership shady? And the answer to that is no. I know the companies such as BlackRock and Vanguard has quite a substantial ownership in the TKO shares, but this is quite normal. To put this to perspective, millions and millions of dollars BlackRock has invested in TKO does not even account to 0.01% of their total investments. So if you're worried about BlackRock's involvement with TKO, trust me, there are much bigger things you should be worried about. And if you go through some of these companies, you would understand these same companies own major shares of bunch of popular companies. Especially considering the fact that this was all publicly available information, it's not shady. And what does this ownership structure means to the UFC, and what does that mean to us as fans? This is where I'll go with the pros first and then later with the cons. Pros being one of the biggest changes that happens to a company when you go public is you need to bring value to the shareholders. You need to bring in more revenue. They do that by putting on banger events that makes people want to leave their home and come and watch these shows, and also take $80 out of their pocket to buy this pay-per-view. It's actually a huge win for us fans, because regardless of how things go, something we can believe in is that we are going to get good events. So that's the pro. Regardless of how that goes, we as fans are going to win. And now to the cons. Well, one of the problems is also the fact that you have to bring in more revenue, and especially profit. And one of the ways you can increase the profit you make is to decrease your cost. This could be lower quality production, and worst case scenario, cutting staff, and also decreasing fighter incentive. And I want to push back on this. Let's address the first. The production quality. UFC has been doing this for a really long time now, that the majority of the production happens in-house. Therefore, the cost is low. Not to mention, sometimes they get a side fee, especially when they have events in Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, a flat pay from ESPN every single event. UFC wanting to lower their production quality to increase their profit is not something that's going to happen in a realistic world. To the second point, mass layoffs, cutting down the staff. Well, this is obviously not going to happen. The main reason being UFC went through the COVID period, he did not fire a single person, and he also made sure none of them get a pay cut. So he basically went above and beyond to stand by his word. So a company that did not lay off people even in one of the most drastic financial markets in the last couple of decades ain't gonna do that just because they want to increase the profit. Now the last part, which is the fight incentive. There is some solid truth to that. There's a reason why there is an UFC antitrust lawsuit, and there's also a reason why certain UFC fighters have pushed into getting more incentive. But I think the condition is going to improve, and the simple reason for that is things such as the UFC antitrust lawsuit. UFC recently agreed to settle this lawsuit for about 300 to 400 millions of dollars. This does not guarantee that they will get sued again. It just means that this lawsuit is done. Just for the record, judge had an issue with the amount UFC was settling this lawsuit for, so he wants to increase the pay. It's not related to this video, but let's just say it's something that's still going on. So regardless of whether UFC win or lose, they still have to spend millions and millions of dollars just defending themselves and settling these lawsuits due to genuine cases. And how could they avoid these millions of dollars of fees? Well, to simply do the right thing. And I assume people at the high level of UFC and their parent companies are well aware of the fact that it's much easier and a better solution to do the right thing and not get sued, rather than doing the wrong thing and saving money in the short run but losing money on the long run due to antitrust lawsuits and other whatnot. And I'm not even just being overly optimistic. Now we know UFC actually gives discretionary bonuses to certain fighters, even if it was not mentioned in their contract. Also, Makaev, I get that you're trying to thank Dana, but you're not meant to tell anybody that. That's the meaning behind the word discretionary. And we are also safe to assume with high possibility that UFC is giving out pay-per-view points to non-championship fighters who are big names. Back in the day, it used to be really exclusive to champions and big names like Conor and Brock Lesnar, and now they're actually doing it a bit more. And I'm not saying the fighting incentive issue is fixed, but I think it's heading to a better direction. And obviously, regardless of what the con is, the most exploitable one is this. So if you still have doubts, I get it, and you are 100% right to assume so. Looking at the big picture, regardless of who owns the UFC, it's going to be good for the fans. And if you look at the timeline, UFC has been publicly trading under TKO for closer to a year now, and we have had some of the best events of all time. UFC 300, in my personal opinion, the best UFC event of all time. And we also had the best UFC trilogy, UFC 298, UFC 299 and UFC 300. And now we have the Las Vegas Sphere. We are deep into this ownership structure. Rather than being skeptical, we can make good assumptions looking at the actual events that took place. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is, as long as the UFC high management structure stays the same without any drastic change, and the fighters stays the same, and especially and most importantly, us as fans, we continue to love the sport and love the events UFC put out, it's going to be fun. If you actually like this video, guess what? This was my first ever YouTube video, and it would mean a lot to me if you could subscribe to my channel and like the video, so YouTube can recommend my future videos to you and bring this video to a much bigger audience. And actually, right now my plan is to make one video per week, and also over time when I get hang of this whole YouTube thing, to do weekly event breakdowns and also fight predictions. So exciting times ahead, and hopefully you will see my next video too, which is coming next week. So yeah, see you.